You are listening to our conversation on trust and inclusion in a hybrid environment, a conversation on disability and shifting work policies. My name is Francis Hernandez, and I am the Tech Equity Research Manager here at Aspen Digital, a policy program of the Aspen Institute. The Tech Accountability Coalition hosted its Q2 working group meetings in June, covering topics such as product equity, pathways in the tech, and inclusive cultures. The conversation on inclusive cultures focused on this year-long theme of trust from a personal to global scale at work. Nicole Cuelller Lopez, the Director of DEI at Etsy and the co-chair for the Coalition's Culture Working Group, opened the conversation about building trust and inclusion in a hybrid work environment. This was followed by a conversation we have recorded for you between Maria Town, the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, or AAPD, and Beth Wiesendanger, the senior manager of diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility at Etsy. The rest of the conversation and chat have been omitted to ensure that the members of the Tech Accountability Coalition are able to speak freely under the Chatham House rule. To learn more about the membership for the Tech Accountability Coalition, please visit our website, linked in the show notes. Here's the conversation.
Nicole Cueller. I'm the Senior Director of Empowered Communities here at Aspen Digital. I lead all of Aspen's work at the intersection of tech, equity, justice, representation for underserved communities. And so the Tech Accountability Coalition is one of several projects in my portfolio. And it's really great to have these conversations and to find ways to interconnect the work that we're doing across the board. We're going to have a conversation between two amazing people. One is Maria Town, who's the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Maria Town previously served as director of the City of Houston Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, advocating for citizens with disabilities. Maria was also the senior associate director in the Obama White House Office of Public Engagement, managing disability community engagement and coordinating federal engagement. Maria has expertise in areas of youth development, leadership, and promoting college and career readiness. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Maria and I actually were both in the Obama White House Office of Public Engagement at the same time. So really glad to have Maria here in a different context to share her experience. And in conversation with Maria is Beth Wiesendanger, who is a senior diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility manager at Etsy. We just heard from Nicole. Beth is on her team as well. And Beth's mission is to ensure more of us are seen, heard, and advocated for. As a disabled woman, she works to leverage the resources she has access to and to create access for those who don't. Beth is a champion of creating opportunities, tearing down cultural and systemic barriers, and fostering community, knowledge, and success. Over Beth's career, she has overseen and executed hundreds of events around the globe, bringing awareness to topics like diversity and creativity, women in tech, accessibility and disability, the future of work, and more. Beth will be leading us in a conversation with Maria. And as the conversation continues, I encourage all of you to don't be shy and drop in questions, comments, reactions in the chat. There'll be some time for Q&A with both Beth and Maria at the end of this, but that also shouldn't stop you from weighing in as the conversation progresses. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Beth and Maria to get it started. So thanks very much. And over to you, Beth and Maria.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm incredibly honored to be here and feel so privileged to be able to chat with you, Maria, about how we can build and foster trust and inclusion across teams, especially through the lens of disability, both apparent and non-apparent. So I'm really excited to chat with you today. I'd love for us to start, if it's okay with you, with a little bit of level setting, talking about some history here. And I'd love to ask you to describe a little bit the shift in the way that companies, especially tech companies, have really shown up or have fallen short of showing up for people with disabilities in a world before and after the pandemic.
Sure, me too. And Beth, very grateful to be in conversation with you, and so grateful to Zaki and his team for inviting me to speak with you all today. I want to provide a visual description for anyone who might need it. I'm a white woman with longish brown hair. I'm wearing a bright pink dress and lipstick and pearls. And your question is a huge one. And so I think one of the very important things that we should just start with is that disabled people have always been kind of users and adapters of technology. And I'll share, I would not be here today without technology. And I mean that very literally. I was born very premature, right? And so the very first interactions that I had were with a lot of tech to keep me alive. I am a part of what's known as the ADA generation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm the first generation of disabled people to grow up with the civil rights protections of both the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was very obvious to everyone who was in that delivery room that I was going to be disabled if I survived. My parents were told that I won't be able to walk or talk, but that they shouldn't be so concerned because there'll be technology. And that was, I really think, something that completely transformed my whole family's idea of what was possible for me. And I don't usually actually start by telling personal stories, especially not that story, but I think it's a really important example of how technology is frequently used as the ideas within technology are used as ideas that can help break down barriers in a world that was absolutely not designed for disabled people. The reality is technology can break down barriers, but it can also exacerbate existing barriers or create new ones. And we see that very commonly within tech companies. I have a background in employment, and one of the things that I like to say is that the employment disparities that we see for people with disabilities are really a reflection of the systemic disparities and barriers that we face throughout every other aspect of our life. So when we look at tech companies and disability hiring, the statistics are usually pretty bad if they exist at all. And so I'm thrilled to see that Etsy actually does include disability in kind of demographic surveys of employees. That is not the standard. And part of the reason those numbers are often so low is because STEM education, whether at the college or graduate level or at the secondary high school level, remains very inaccessible. And I'll shout out my colleagues at organizations like the National Federation of the Blind who have sued college after college to make math education accessible. And one of the things that I would love to see from technology companies who recognize this gap is a willingness to work with institutions and with other organizations that are the standard setting bodies for curricula to actually make this curricula accessible in different ways. Another area where we've seen technology companies espouse values of inclusion and not really live up to them is they'll promote products as a kind of accessibility boon, but disabled people are not actually included in the process of design. And if we are, we're not included as designers ourselves, we're included as testers. And user testing is extremely important. Thorough user testing, diverse user testing, extremely important. But I really want to see a world where disabled people are not just testers on the kind of end of a design process, but are really engaging in design leadership within companies from the very start. AAPD as an organization, a part of our charter almost 30 years ago, was actually ensuring that people with disabilities could take advantage of all of the benefits that technology has to offer us. So it's a huge part of what we do. Does that begin to answer your question?
It's a big question. I'm glad I didn't say in 10 words or less because that's impossible. But what you said really resonates with me. It's this idea of nothing for us without us that we hear quite often in the disability community. And as a DEI practitioner, I think the A is missing from a lot of the DE&I programs that I see in the industry, right? The diversity, equity, and inclusion and access. Accessibility is so important, and we often don't see that. And I agree, as I am also a first generation of the eight, and I've lived with that, and I'm starting to see things shift and starting to see things change. But you're right. I think a lot of times in the industry, the disabled community is brought in after a product is created to gut check, but they're not there at the start. So I love that you said that. Love to hear your thoughts because really pre-pandemic, there were many workplaces that fell short of accommodating people with disabilities with remote work. And then, of course, the pandemic happened. We had to figure it out. Now hybrid and remote work are really a way of life. I'm really curious to hear from you some concrete ways that companies can build remote and hybrid work strategies that feel really inclusive for everyone.
What a wonderful question. And Beth, you're exactly right. There are so many jobs where people with disabilities would ask for remote work as an accommodation, only to be told pre-pandemic that this job cannot be done remotely, and they would be denied accommodations and oftentimes either lose out on professional advancement opportunities or be fired or have to find a new job. And it was both amazing and pretty deeply frustrating when the COVID-19 pandemic happened. And I want to be clear, it's still happening. And as soon as non-disabled people needed remote work options, we saw companies just make major pivots and investments into this remote and flexible work infrastructure that didn't exist previously. And many companies have maintained this infrastructure and continued to iterate. I'll use Zoom as an example. Zoom is a company and a platform where we have seen them continue to make changes in how they operate to make their platform more accessible and inclusive over time. On the topic of AI, the automated captions that Zoom provides today are drastically improved from what they started with a few years ago. And initially, they didn't really offer integrated automated captioning. So I think that is one example of a very tangible tool that companies now have access to, whether it is across a platform like Zoom or Teams or Google Meets. We should no longer be in a place where employees have to disclose a disability and ask for accommodations for something like captions to be turned on. I want to harken back to the conversation that happened previously in terms of building trust. A key part of building trust is transparency, and establishing transparency within your remote work practices so that employees are clear on when they should be reporting kind of issues or difficulties, when they should be telling you about moments of joy and moments where things worked, and how those kind of reports are being translated into either new practices or policies across the organization. It is so important. One of the things that is a reality of being disabled is an experience of poverty. And while remote work is extremely beneficial to people with disabilities, we have seen improvements in disability employment that have never happened before, and many attribute that to the greater availability of remote work. People with disabilities also experience huge digital divides and lack access to things like a consistent internet connection or to a device. And so making sure that your company's remote work policies, especially for employees who may not qualify for full-time benefits or who are newer employees or, again, have less access to benefits, can get their internet connection funded as an employee benefit or their device funded, and for their device, including assistive devices like screen readers or any kind of particular motor skill tools, things like that. All of that needs to be wrapped into a remote work policy.
Yeah, I love that. And it's something that I'm very appreciative that Etsy takes a very strong approach to, in the sense that we think about how do we give funding for people to have the setup that works best for them so they can do their best work at home, whatever that might look like. Something you said really resonated with me about the tangible things that companies could do. One of the things that we've found in this hybrid world, speaking to the curb cut, is that a lot of things that people in the disability and the neurodivergence community are asking for, like really clear written communication, very clear agendas, follow-up action items, making sure that we're sending information in as many ways as possible, whether that's written, recorded, or both. Those are things that have been implemented in the workplace that have really made a difference for everyone's understanding. You mentioned captions. We are a global workforce, right? Many companies are. Many people, English is not their first language. So all of these things really help, of course, the disabled community, but really everybody be able to access information more equitably. And I love how you laid that out. You mentioned trust, and I'm really curious to hear from you. You talked a bit about trust being about transparency. I'm wondering if there are some examples you can provide on how companies can really build authentic trust with historically underrepresented employee groups.
I noticed in the chat, someone mentioned having Disability Awareness Month programming, and I think that's so important. And I actually think kind of meeting people where they're at in terms of what language they're using to describe themselves is also very important. Now, I am very proud to be disabled. It's in the name of our organization. That word shows up in my bio 5 million times. In my world, disability is not a bad word. I use people with disabilities and disabled people, both. But some people, because disability has been so heavily stigmatized, if you're doing Disability Awareness Month programming, they will not see themselves in that. And that is okay. So the question for all of us then is, what kind of programming, what kind of resource will people, maybe they have a chronic illness, maybe they're very new to a diagnosis and are still terrified about what tomorrow looks like. What kinds of programming will they see themselves in? And I think it is so important for information about accessibility and inclusion to be included at almost every point of employee engagement. And I loved when the previous speaker described the simple acronym that the first word is shared, because employees should not only hear about accommodations and accessibility during their onboarding or during maybe a mid-year performance review. Accessibility, like so much in the tech space, is really iterative. And the accommodations process, there's something called the interactive conversation. And I think this is incredibly important for people to understand. Many disabled people may not even be aware of what options are out there for them in terms of accommodations. And disability, as a natural part of the human condition, changes over time. I have lived with my disability, cerebral palsy, my entire life. And literally every day, I'm like, figuring out that it's doing something new. And I'm just like, what do I do now? And so folks need to be open to having those conversations and open to exploring different tools and work arrangements that might be better for people at different times. Building trust with self-disclosure. I hope that people don't feel like they should have to use the word disability in order to count, right? So if they're disclosing that they have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or that they have diabetes, that whoever they're disclosing that information to has enough of a kind of reference frame to recognize that this is disability disclosure that's happening. What do you think about that, Beth?
Yeah, I think that's right. What I'm hearing you say is that it takes education on both ends, right? Like it takes a really educated team of professionals on the employer side to really have a human-centered approach and to understand that conversations about disability accommodations, they change over time. What you need today might not be what you need tomorrow. And also you might not need anything today. And maybe 3 months from now you do, or maybe you don't anymore. So there's that education piece. And it's interesting because Nicole mentioned our self-ID campaign around disability. Something that I think you're speaking to is also the education that disability is such a wide umbrella. There is so much that goes under the umbrella of disability as it's defined by the ADA. And we found there were many people who didn't realize that they qualified, or people who didn't feel disabled enough, which is a whole other subject that I could talk to as a disabled woman, right? Am I disabled enough to say I'm disabled? So that education piece was really critical for us as well, to really show people that they are enough, they're a valued member of the community. And really, what do we mean when we say disabled or neurodiverse? It's so many things.
And Beth, I just want to say for everyone, if you are asking yourself, am I disabled enough? The answer is yes. If you are asking yourself that question, the answer is yes. And I think that your point is exactly right.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'd love to talk to you. When we talk about self-ID, we're really talking about representation, visibility. And something I heard you hint at earlier is that there can be a concern that remote work, if it's only exclusively for people with disabilities, it can become this form of separation and segregation, right? And companies may see remote options as an alternative to creating accessible in-person spaces and experiences. So I'm curious to hear from you how companies can ensure really a shared and positive experience for both remote and in-person employees who have disabilities.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Beth, because it's a concern that AAPD has very deeply. And it's one of the reasons we have this concern is because we have seen this play out in the education space, where as remote education has become more of an option, students with kind of the most complex access needs are forced into remote-only schools. And this works very well for some people. And there are other people who really want to be in shared space, in shared physical space with colleagues in person. And again, what we don't want to see happen is all of the gains that disabled people have made because of things like advancements in visibility and advancements in public policy and civil rights are actually, we go backwards because we are no longer in shared real space together. So I think one thing that companies can do is continue to ensure, if you are doing a disability or accessibility audit of your websites and of your remote platforms that you're using, your project management systems, for example, are you also continuing to do an audit of your physical space? Do your offices continue to suit your employees' needs, whether or not they go there every day or whether they are there every quarter? If you are hosting events in person where your remote workers have an opportunity to attend, are you incorporating opportunities for people to disclose their access needs in the invitation? I'm trying to think of how to say this, and I think I'm just going to say this. I have cerebral palsy, and when I show up in real space and you see me like walk around or move with my mobility device, I am very disabled with a capital D. And all of that sort of visibility goes away when you see me on Zoom because you see me from here up and I'm sitting in one place. And I don't know if you are still experiencing this, but I feel like as people began to return to in-person interactions after the public health emergency ended, you had folks being like, oh, wow, Maria, you're really short. I didn't realize how short you were. And those moments of, oh, wow, like you talk about disability, but you are really disabled. Like you really need support or help. Is everyone prepared to welcome folks on their own terms in this new kind of engagement? And I don't have great words for this, but I want to emphasize that maintaining a culture of inclusion in your physical workplaces is more than just about addressing something like ADA compliance and physical accessibility. It is actually making sure that when your blind employees who have worked remotely for 2 years show up to your company picnic, people actually know that they can talk to them and not feel awkward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's definitely still that happening where people are coming in and meeting each other for the first time. And that idea of what does inclusive behavior look like when we're talking about disability and disability etiquette, maybe, right? So there's the education and the awareness. And something that you hinted at just then was ADA compliance. I think that oftentimes when organizations think about disability inclusion or trust building or belonging, for so long historically, I believe the approach has really been risk mitigation, right? It's been that compliance mindset. And we're just starting to see a more human-centered approach to what disability inclusion can really look like. And so I'm curious to hear from you, do you have any concrete examples of how companies can really go above and beyond that minimum requirement of the ADA to really build an inclusive work environment for people with disabilities?
Yes. So one thing that is important to say is compliance is still important. Like compliance is still very important, and not just from a risk management perspective, but there are still so many companies that actually don't create accessible and inclusive spaces where, from a kind of retail perspective, people with disabilities can't reach the card reader to actually spend money, or they can't get through the door. Still very real needs in this space. And Americans with Disabilities Act is the floor and not the ceiling, right? And I will say that over and over again. So I think one way that companies can go beyond compliance, in addition to ensuring at a very basic level that you are compliant, but creating a human-centered workplace, as you've already mentioned, Beth, multiple times, right? The employees should be able to show up as they are and who they are at work. And if that means that they need a different desk arrangement or chair, does that need to be through an accommodations process that requires a doctor's note to sign off on? You probably did not expect me to bring this up, but many accommodations processes require the involvement of a medical practitioner. And that is because of the historic idea that disability is somehow the domain of medicine. In the disability community, we talk a lot about something called the medical model, which identifies that disability is an individual problem within someone's body or mind that needs to be cured or mitigated. The disability rights movement really pushed something called the social model, which articulated that people are not disabled as a result of something that is inherently wrong with them, but disabled by society's ideas of what is normal and disabled by things like physical barriers. And in reality, there's really a need for both, right? If you're someone who has chronic pain, you're going to need involvement from a competent healthcare professional, and you're going to need a chair that doesn't exacerbate your pain. Both things are true, but oftentimes doctors are not involved in our day-to-day lives. And yet the moment people need accommodations, they've got to go make a doctor's appointment, get this form filled out, and give it to their employer when the physician has never seen them engage in any other environment besides an exam room. And that is, again, a pretty detailed explanation of how not human-centered these processes are. So instead of an accommodations process that is really, again, centered on this medical model of disability, what is a process for accommodating all of your employees that recognizes different human needs in the workplace? And I know one thing that we wanted to talk about was how AI could be used to make the accommodations process easier. And I think that this is actually one of the places where AI could be very useful for employees to say, here's how I like to do my work. What kind of setup is best for me? My mind works best from, this is not true for me, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Like, how can I structure my day to be the most effective? I think there's so many things companies can do. Beth, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that companies historically have really relied on, as you said, the medical model for so long. And I think part of that, again, is because the way that these processes have been built historically they didn't have people with disabilities helping build the processes, right? So you have a process that's very rooted in how things have always been done, but it's not necessarily how things need to be done now and into the future. I always believe in prioritizing like live human conversation first and understanding that needs change over time. To your point, growing up, anytime I wear prosthetics, anytime I needed prosthetics, I would have my prosthetician basically write out what the doctor then needed to put on the prescription that then went to the health insurance for the health insurance to know like how to code everything in. So I think it's just a recognizing that process has been traditionally very convoluted. And what can we do to make it easier, not just on the person who's needing an accommodation, but also on the people who are helping empower folks to get the things that they need, right? Because at the end of the day, the goal is the same. The goal is for us to be able to show up and do as our best selves and do our best work. So I really love what you're saying about how I do think there's this opportunity to leverage technology in the future. I'd love to ask you just one more question. We talked a lot about technology. We've talked a lot about how we can truly build an inclusive environment, how we can create a higher level of trust. I'm curious to hear from you, just looking ahead, what are some of your biggest hopes about how technology can create a more accessible and equitable work environment? And not even just for people with disabilities, but really broadly.
So I think we've actually already touched on some of what my biggest hopes will continue to be. Remote work was not just a boon for people with disabilities, it was also a boon for women. And if we look at like the ways in which women's participation in the workforce began to change as more employers shifted back into in-person work requirements, many women left the workforce. And my hope is that for disabled people, technology is everything that it says it can be without an increase in things like surveillance or further exclusion. And I also want us to live in a world where we recognize the value of doing things analog and also understand that technology is never neutral. So when looking at something like AI, I see artificial intelligence and automated decision tools being used in ways that really support greater independence and agency and control for disabled people. When I think about, I recently read a piece that was written by a woman who used ChatGPT to help her write a script to tell her parents she wanted to live in her own apartment. And this is someone who has what we would call like significant disabilities and ultimately escaped her parents and was housing insecure for a while. But I think that these tools have a great deal of promise. But I also think that tech tools that claim accessibility as a benefit should really have to prove their case before they're allowed to just go forth and conquer, which is how it feels a little bit. And I'll use examples. We're seeing companies begin to use these AI employment decision tools for recruitment and hiring and then continued monitoring of workers. And even one of my own colleagues at AAPD, before he came to AAPD, he applied for a job and had a robot camera monitoring his interview to see if he made appropriate eye contact. And this is someone who spasms and has tremors, and he had no idea if the robot was going to register his eye contact or if it was going to understand his speech accurately. We are beginning to see disparate impacts happening for disabled people and people of color with these kinds of tools. And it's frustrating because the job interview process is already so biased and so inaccessible to so many people. So the idea that these tools do provide a more neutral sort of under assessment of a particular employee is a really exciting one. But again, because of the sort of historic exclusion of disabled people from tech spaces, there's often not even room to flag these things as potential issues. And when I think about, again, like how would someone request an accommodation if they knew that a company was using AI to make an employment decision? Is that accommodation just a standard interview? Is that used against them in the future? I think there's so much work that we need to do to build out the structures that can help people make informed decisions, whether that is an individual in deciding what they want an interview process to look like, or a company figuring out like how they will actually accommodate job seekers and employees with disabilities as they begin to use new tools that we haven't tested as much because they're so new, but we want to explore because we need the efficiency.
Yeah, I love that. Technology is a tool, but it doesn't exist outside of the system in which it was built. Thank you so much. I've loved chatting with you, and I'm excited to turn it back to Aspen.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Beth. That was really an amazing, inspiring conversation. I really appreciated that. And I know a lot of folks on the call did as well. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions or thoughts. After this conversation, we're going to go to a more general discussion where everyone can weigh in with their thoughts. But anybody have any specific thoughts or questions or comments for Beth and Maria?
Yeah, I have a question. I know I'm privileged here as an organizer, but how do you disaggregate between such a conglomerate community of people with disabilities, ranging from, I know, Maria, you mentioned diabetes to ALS to neurodivergence? And how do you make sure that you are, one, collecting the right level of granular data, and two, building for everybody under that group?
I think from an EDC perspective, what we were really hoping to do is create a culture where we had a more accurate understanding of the breadth of our employee base who identified as having a disability or a neurodivergence. And so for us, what was important from a self-ID perspective was to really, again, educate. So when we updated our self-ID questionnaire this year, really putting in a definition for U.S. employees of the ADA and all of the examples that exist underneath the ADA. So really the question we were asking is, yes, I have a disability or a neurodivergence or have had a history of having one. No, I don't, or I don't wish to identify. And for our purposes, it's really helpful to get a better understanding of a more authentic number of how many employees are working at our company who have disabilities. From a community standpoint, when we talk about our employee resource group and the sub-communities that form, it's really important to make sure that we have groups that feel broad enough to form connection, but also specific enough to really differentiate and make sure that people feel like they themselves are represented and their experiences are represented. So we have a formal ERG, an accessibility ERG, and under that ERG, we have several sub-communities that are more specific to what people are really experiencing and showing up with and want to identify and connect with other people over. So the grassroots community portion is really led by who's here and who feels safe enough and who wants to talk and engage and it feels really specific. And then from an ID perspective, again, we really try to educate around the wide umbrella that the ADA encompasses.
This is Maria. I think that approach is exactly right. I also, when you think about the idea of designing for all, that does not mean that there needs to be one design. And I think the idea of universal design, for example, is extremely appealing and it's a great thing to aspire to. But given the diversity of not just the disability experience, but the human experience itself, there can be a need for specific types of solutions to accommodate specific groups of people. And I actually think that there can be really good examples of this where folks feel validated and seen and appreciated when they are not forced to actually accommodate themselves to a particular solution that claims to be universal. So I think in designing your policies and programs and your products, obviously centering accessibility and inclusion and making things as inclusive as possible, but being willing to consider when people might need something else. And the process that Beth described where they're educating people on this big, broad definition of disability while allowing folks to show up as they are and self-select into other groups that really reflect their own personal experiences is an example of how you do that from the kind of people side.
Thank you so much.
The question in the chat that I would love to answer. I have tinnitus and multiple occurrences of Bell's palsy. As far as I understand, neither is officially registered as a disability. Understanding that, is there a way to still request accommodations without being seen as an annoying employee? When there is no register of disabilities, the Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as any physical or mental condition that impacts an activity of daily living. And activities of daily living are everything from speaking, understanding information, eating, getting dressed, reading, being in your community, and beyond. Again, if you are experiencing a disability, even if you don't see a condition reflected in a list from an organization or on a website, that's okay, because there is no formal registry of disabilities. And I think that your concern about being seen as an annoying employee when you request an accommodation reflects an issue of inclusive culture. And so I would always say if you need an accommodation, you should request it. But if your fear is that people will think of you as annoying, that is actually a sign of much bigger problems within an organization where disability is not seen, again, as a part of their kind of employee body. It's seen as this thing that people just have to deal with. And I hope that helps.